The wind that night had a voice thin, cutting almost human. It howled through the narrow streets of Seattle, turning the rain into needles and the puddles into mirrors that fractured every passing light. The city glowed cold, slick and distant, a place that never seemed to sleep, only shift its weight from one ache to another. At the edge of a quiet block stood a corner store, its fluorescent sign flickering against the storm. Inside, the air was warm and faintly sweet, with coffee and detergent. It was the kind of place people forgot existed until they needed something they couldn't do without. Elena Ward pushed through the door, a bell chiming weakly above her head. Her coat was soaked through her curls, damp against her cheeks. In her arms, two small bundles, twin boys, less than a year old, shifted softly, their breaths tiny puffs against her neck. She looked exhausted, but in her eyes, there was still that quiet kind of determination only mothers carried, the kind that refused to break, no matter how cold the world turned. She headed straight to the back of the store. The aisle was lined with cans of baby formula, the good kind, the kind her pediatrician said would help her boys keep weight on through the winter. She picked it up, the label, bright, the price, sharp. At the counter, she set it down carefully, almost reverently, as if it were glass. Then she lowered her tote to the floor, pulled out a plastic bag filled with coins, and began to count. Quarters, dimes, nickels, each one stacked in trembling columns, her fingers stiff from the cold. The cashier, a woman with a kind, tired face, punched the numbers into the register. When the final beep sounded, she looked up and spoke softly. "You're short? $1.37. Elena froze. It wasn't the amount, it was the sound of the words. Short, like a verdict, like she had failed by a hair's breadth. The line behind her shifted. Someone sighed. Another coughed impatiently. The twins stirred in her arms, sensing her tension. She swallowed hard. "I can put it back," she whispered. "I'll come tomorrow." Her voice barely carried over the hum of the fluorescent lights. Before she could lift the can from the counter, a black metal card slid across it. Heavy. Matte. The edges caught the light. A man's voice, low and sure, broke the silence. "Add it to mine." The cashier hesitated only a second before running the card. Elena turned and met his eyes. He was tall, the kind of tall that filled a doorway. His coat, dark cashmere, clung to the rain. His hair was damp, falling slightly across his forehead. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was steady, almost solemn. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he said simply, "but I will." His tone wasn't condescending or heroic. It was factual, like gravity, something that simply was. Before she could thank him, the transaction was done. The cashier handed her the formula. The man gave a small nod, and that was it. No lingering, no grand gestures. He turned away as if to leave. Elena's throat tightened. "Thank you," she said anyway. But he was already at the door, opening it to the rain. Outside, the storm had worsened. The street gleamed under the neon lights, rivers of water chasing down the gutters. Elena stepped out, holding her twins tight against her chest. The cold bit through her sleeves instantly. Behind her, through the store window, the man stood still, watching. She didn't see him. But if she had, she might have noticed the look in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, quickly hidden behind restraint. A delivery truck roared past, splashing up a wave that drenched her legs and the baby's blankets. They whimpered, startled by the shock. "Elena," a voice called through the storm. She turned. The man, the stranger, was striding toward her, an umbrella snapping open above his head. "How do you know my name?" she asked, startled. He hesitated. "You dropped this." He held out a small ID badge from the warehouse where she worked, or rather, used to work. The company's logo was faded, but familiar. Adrian Cole. He introduced himself as he handed it to her. His name was printed on the black card he used embossed clean. She blinked, realizing why it sounded familiar. He wasn't just a man with a black card. He was the CEO of Cole Dynamics, the same company that had laid off hundreds, including her last spring. The world tilted. For a moment, the rain seemed to go silent. "You," she started, but he was already stepping closer, holding the umbrella over all three of them. "It's coming down harder," he said. "Let me drive you home." Her chest tightened. She wanted to refuse. Pride burned under her ribs like a stubborn flame. But her twins shivered in her arms, their tiny faces buried against her coat. "I take the bus," she murmured. "Not tonight." His voice was calm, but firm. "They shouldn't be out here." For a moment she met his eyes, blue-gray, unreadable. No pity, just something else, something steadier. She nodded once. The car was warm, the kind of warmth that felt almost foreign after a day spent outside. The scent of leather and rain filled the silence. The twins, exhausted, drifted into sleep. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice small but sincere. He didn't look over. "You don't have to thank me. People don't usually stop," she said. "Not in this city." He gave a quiet, almost sad smile. Maybe they should. They didn't talk after that. The hum of the engine and the soft breaths of the babies filled the space between them. When they reached her building, a cracked aging complex on the south side, Adrian's expression changed. He studied it for a long time, his jaw tightening. "I used to live in a place like this," he said, almost to himself. She didn't know what to say. The thought of him in any place like this felt impossible. But she didn't question it. She opened the door carefully, cradling her twins, clutching the formula. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she said softly. He nodded. "Get them warm." Rain drummed on the roof of the car as she climbed the stairs. From her window she could see him still standing there alone, motionless, a dark silhouette against the storm, watching until her light turned on. That night, after she'd fed the twins and tucked them beneath the thin quilt, Elena stood by the window. The storm had softened into a whisper. Down below, the street was empty, but she could still see the faint tracks of tires, and beside them, the outline of boot prints leading to her door and back. She didn't know why that detail mattered, only that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. Across the city in a penthouse of glass, and quiet, Adrian Cole sat in front of a wall of screens. His reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, perfect posture eyes that never quite rested. On one of the screens was a list of employees, former employees from Cole Dynamics' last round of layoffs. He scrolled until he found the name, Elena Ward. He exhaled slowly. He remembered the petition, the pleading email she had written when her position was cut. He hadn't read it then. He read it now. And for the first time in years, he felt something shift, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't charity. It was recognition. Because once, long before the glass walls and black cars, Adrian had been the child watching his mother count coins under a store's flickering light. Outside, the city slept under the storm's dying breath. 2 lives, one built on money, one on survival, had brushed against each other in the cold, and something unseen had begun to move. A thread delicate but certain connecting 2 hearts that didn't yet know they were searching for the same warmth. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a hope, a quiet ache, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Because sometimes Love doesn't arrive with fireworks. It shows up on a rainy night holding an umbrella and says simply, "You shouldn't have to face this storm alone." The city was still trembling from the rain when Adrian turned the wheel and merged into the slow crawl of midnight traffic. Streetlights shimmered through the windshield, long golden streaks that blurred against the glass. Inside the car, warmth gathered like breath on a windowpane. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her twins tucked against her chest, their small bodies heavy with sleep. The soft rhythm of their breathing filled the silence. She was grateful for the heat, but wary of it too. Kindness had always carried a cost in her life, and she couldn't quite believe this stranger. This man wanted nothing in return. Adrian's eyes stayed on the road. Rain whispered across the roof. Now and then, headlights flashed over his profile, the precise line of his jaw, the faint bruise of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the steadiness of a man used to hiding whatever he felt. "You knew my name," she said quietly, her voice no more than a thread. "How?" He glanced at her, then back at the road. "You dropped your ID badge at the counter," he replied. The name was right there. She nodded, clutching the babies closer. Still, there was something in the way he said it, a weight she couldn't place. Her badge bore the logo of Coal Dynamics, the company that had let her go 7 months ago. Back then, she had written a letter to the CEO, a desperate, careful thing, asking for a delay on the layoff so she could keep her health insurance until the twins were born. No one had answered. She looked at him again. The suit, the card, the confidence that clung to him like another kind of armor. "Cole," she whispered, testing the name. "Are you related to?" That Cole Adrian's hands tightened on the wheel. For a moment the rain seemed to still. "I am that Cole," he said at last. Her stomach dropped. The world shrank to the sound of wipers beating time. "So, you're the reason I lost my job." Her words were flat, but the ache behind them was sharp. He didn't defend himself. He only nodded once, eyes steady on the wet road ahead. "I didn't know your name then," he said. "I only knew numbers on a spreadsheet. Tonight I do." She wanted to hate him for that calm, for the luxury of distance it carried. But when she looked at him, at the rain sliding down his temple, at the quiet sincerity that had nothing to do with power hatred wouldn't come. Only a tired sorrow, deep and old. They reached her neighborhood. The pavement here was cracked, the street lamps dim. A cat darted between trash bins. The building loomed ahead, brick worn thin by years of storms. Adrian slowed to a stop. "I'll walk you to the door." "You don't have to." The words came out sharper than she meant. She wasn't used to anyone staying long enough to help. "I know," he said again, that same steady tone. "But I want to." He got out, holding the umbrella so it covered her and the twins. His hand brushed her shoulder lightly as they crossed the sidewalk. Even through her damp coat, she could feel the warmth of it, a reminder that she was still flesh and breath, not just fatigue in motion. Inside the small foyer, the light buzzed weakly. Water dripped from their coats. She turned to him, unsure what to say to a man who could buy anything, yet had chosen to spend his night here carrying the quiet weight of strangers. "You should go," she said softly. "People might get the wrong idea." "What idea is that?" He met her gaze, and for the first time, there was something gentle in his voice. "That I cared." The air between them trembled. Elena looked away first. Her throat was tight, her heart too loud. "I don't need charity," she managed. "I know," he said again, but this time his voice was lower, almost regretful. "I didn't offer any." He nodded once and stepped back into the rain, closing the umbrella, letting the storm take him. By the time she climbed the stairs to her apartment, His car had disappeared into the night. Upstairs, Elena fed the twins by the dim light of a single lamp. Their tiny fingers curled around hers, their eyes heavy. The formula he had paid for sat on the counter, a silver canister glowing faintly in the warm light. She traced the edge of the label with her fingertip, remembering the feel of his voice when he'd said her name. Outside, the rain eased. A bus hissed to a stop down the block, headlights cutting across the window. For a brief second, she imagined getting on riding until the city gave way to silence, to some place where the world didn't keep score. But then, one of the babies stirred, and reality pulled her back. She glanced at her phone. The screen lit with an unfamiliar number. A single text. "I hope you and the boys are safe. AC." She stared at it for a long time before setting the phone face down. She wasn't sure if she wanted safety or a reason to trust it again. Across town, Adrian parked in front of a dark glass tower that scraped at the clouds. His reflection stared back from the marble lobby, expensive, immaculate, lonely. He loosened his tie, but the tension stayed. He hadn't meant to follow her. He'd only stopped at that corner store because it was open late, and he needed coffee. Or maybe he thought bitterly because he'd been driving aimlessly since his board meeting, unable to shake the image of another woman from years ago. His mother standing under the same kind of rain, counting quarters for bus fare she could never afford. He opened his laptop, the blue light stark against his tired face. Elena's email from the past blinked up on the screen, the one he hadn't read. The words blurred as his chest tightened. "I'm due in 6 weeks. If there's any way to extend my insurance. I can take unpaid leave. I just need the coverage for my babies." He shut the computer with a sharp breath. Some mistakes had no elegant way to fix them. But maybe there were ways to make amends. He reached for his phone, typed a message, deleted it, typed again. Finally, he left it at that simple check-in, a quiet thread between two worlds that never should have met. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed and brittle. Elena stood at the window, the twins curled in their crib, sunlight brushing their faces. For the first time in months, she didn't have to ration their formula. It shouldn't have felt like hope, but it did. When the phone buzzed again that afternoon, she hesitated before answering. A delivery driver's voice came through. "Package for E. Ward paid in full." 2 boxes waited by her door. Inside were diapers, wipes, and a note written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "Consider this a little more breathing room." No name, just the initials, AC. She pressed the paper to her chest, then folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer. That evening, the rain returned, gentler this time, like a memory rather than a storm. Elena turned off the light, sat by the crib, and listened to the soft sighs of her sons. She thought of the man in the black coat and the strange pull that had settled between them. Not romance, not yet, but something warmer than gratitude and heavier than chance. Somewhere downtown, Adrian stood at the glass wall of his penthouse, looking out over the same rain. In his reflection, he saw not the billionaire everyone envied, but the boy who had once gone hungry, who had once needed someone to care, without asking why. And in that quiet distance between them, a worn apartment and a tower of steel, the faint outline of a story began to take shape. Not a rescue, not a debt, something more fragile, more dangerous, a possibility neither of them was ready to name. The following week moved slowly, as if the city itself were catching its breath after too many nights of rain. The air had softened. The sky, once a sheet of gray, now blushed with pale sun over the rooftops. For Elena Ward, each day began the same quietly, carefully, as though any sudden move might break the fragile peace she'd found. She rose before dawn, fed the twins, and walked to the warehouse job she'd managed to pick up through a temp agency. It paid by the hour. No benefits, no promises. But it was something. Still, the memory of that night lingered the stranger with the black card, the warmth of his car, the weight in his eyes when he'd said, "I am that Cole." It should have turned her cold. But instead, she found herself thinking about him when she least expected to, when she saw rain on the window, or when she heard a quiet, careful voice that carried the same calm. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more. One Thursday evening, Elena returned home to find another package at her door. This time it wasn't formula or diapers. It was a box wrapped in plain brown paper, the sender listed only as CD Holdings. Inside were 2 small blankets, thick soft, stitched in pale blue. Beneath them, a note, "For colder nights. I remember what those felt like. AC." Elena sat down on the couch, the letter trembling in her hand. The twins, cooing in their crib, reached for the blankets, their fingers curling in the fabric. It was too much, too intimate, and yet, as she watched them settle, she couldn't make herself angry. She whispered to the empty room, "You don't even know us." But maybe he did, in some way she couldn't understand. Across town, Adrian Cole stood on the balcony of his glass-walled apartment, the wind pushing cold against his face. The city stretched beneath him, all order and ambition glowing under 1,000 lights. Yet somehow, it felt smaller than it used to. In his hands was a photograph, a black-and-white image of his mother taken decades ago. She stood in front of a red brick apartment building, smiling shyly at the camera, a young woman in a thrifted coat. That building still stood. He had seen it last week when he drove Elena home, and only that morning his assistant had confirmed it. That same address once appeared on his mother's old employment record. She'd worked at a textile factory on that street. So had another woman, Clara Ward, Elena's mother. The past, it seemed, had its own strange sense of timing. He turned the photo over. In his mother's handwriting, faded and neat, it said, "Clara and I, first day at the factory. She made me laugh all day." Adrian's throat tightened. He remembered the fire that took the factory, the way his mother had barely made it out alive. She'd told him once that a friend had pulled her from the smoke, saving her life. She never said the woman's name. Now, decades later, Adrian finally knew. Saturday came with crisp winter light. Elena bundled the twins in their new blankets and carried them down to the laundromat at the corner. The machines hummed. The air smelled of soap and metal. She fed coins into the dryer, the rhythm comforting in its small mechanical way. The glass door chimed. A rush of cold air followed a familiar voice. "I was hoping I'd run into you," Adrian said. Elena froze, then turned. He was there. No chauffeur, no umbrella, no pretense. Just a man in a wool coat, sleeves rolled up, carrying a small paper bag. Her first instinct was caution. Her second, something softer. "You do your own laundry?" she asked, folding a shirt to steady her hands. He smiled faintly. "Not exactly. My building's machines broke." She lifted an eyebrow. "In that building of yours, I doubt it." He laughed quietly. "Maybe I just needed an excuse." It was the kind of laughter that didn't echo, it settled low and warm. For a while they didn't talk. The hum of the dryers filled the space between them. The twins dozed in their stroller, the sunlight catching in their curls. Adrian's gaze lingered on them, gentle, thoughtful. "They sleep well." "Better than I do." Elena said, her lips curving despite herself. "Sounds familiar," he murmured. "My mom used to say the same about me." Something in his tone, soft, reverent, made her look up. She must have been patient. "She was," he said. She raised me alone for a while. She was strong and scared, sometimes both at once. Elena folded the last towel, her hands slowing. Sounds like every mother I know. Adrian hesitated, then said quietly, I think she knew your mother. Her heart skipped. What do you mean? He told her about the photograph, the factory, the address they'd shared, about the way his mother had written her mother's name on the back of that picture. When he pulled the faded photograph from his pocket, Elena stared. Her mother's face looked back at her, young, smiling, alive. The sound that left her lips was halfway between a laugh and a sob. That's her, she whispered. She used to tell me stories about a girl who made her laugh during the fire drills. Adrian's smile softened. Then it's true. They stood there for a moment, two strangers joined by something older than either of them. The dryers hummed, the sunlight glowed gold across the tiles, and outside, the wind eased. Later, as Adrian walked her home, the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt almost sacred. At her building, he stopped at the base of the stairs. Elena, he said gently, if you ever need anything beyond groceries or blankets, you can ask me. She wanted to say no. Pride still lived in her, stubborn as an old scar. But when she looked at him, she saw not a billionaire, not a man who'd once cost her a job, but a child who'd once needed saving too. So she said nothing. And in that silence, something unspoken took root, small, tentative, but real. That night, after the twins were asleep, Elena placed the photograph on her dresser. Her mother's eyes seemed to shine in the lamplight, as if seeing through time. She traced her mother's face with her thumb and whispered, You brought him back to me, didn't you? Down the street in his car, Adrian watched the same window, where her light burned faintly against the dark. He didn't know why he couldn't drive away, only that somehow in the quiet flicker of that window, he saw home something he hadn't felt in years. And in the soft hum of the city night, a promise neither of them had made yet began to form, that perhaps after all the storms and all the mistakes, love might still find its way through the smallest acts of grace. Spring came late to Seattle that year. The rain had finally learned to fall softly, like a secret whispered only to those still awake. Trees along the block began to bloom shyly, at first, then in small bursts of white and pink that looked almost too hopeful for the gray sky above. Elena noticed the change on her morning walks. The light felt gentler now, and sometimes when she pushed the twins' stroller down the narrow sidewalk, she caught herself smiling for no reason she could name. It wasn't that life had grown easy, far from it. The bills still came. Her warehouse shifts were still long, and the ache in her back at night was still sharp. But lately she'd been carrying something quieter alongside the exhaustion, something that felt dangerously close to comfort. And most of that had begun after Adrian reappeared. He didn't show up often, not the way a man chasing something would. He appeared instead like a steady rhythm in her weak, small, unannounced moments that stitched themselves into her days. Once, she ran into him at the grocery store. He was standing in front of the cereal aisle reading labels, like he had never been in one before. She couldn't help laughing. You look lost. He turned, smiling. I'm trying to find something that doesn't have a sugar warning or an ad for a cartoon rabbit. Well, she said, good luck with that. He ended up following her through the aisles, carrying her basket while she balanced the twins. When she hesitated at the price of something, the good brand of baby food, the box of cereal she used to buy before money got tight, she noticed his gaze flicker, thoughtful but silent. He never offered to pay again. That was what she appreciated most. He seemed to know that sometimes the kindest thing wasn't giving more, it was giving space. One evening, he came by her apartment with a box in his arms. It wasn't new. The cardboard was soft, The tape yellowed with time. Inside were toys, small wooden blocks, a worn stuffed bear, a wooden train. "These were mine," he said almost shyly. "They've been sitting in storage for years. I thought your boys might like them." Elena lifted the train. The paint was chipped in places, but she could tell it had been loved. "You kept all this." "My mother did," he said. "She saved everything. She used to say she couldn't throw away a memory." "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was," he said quietly. "She died young. Cancer. I was in college." Elena's voice softened. "I'm sorry." He nodded, looking past her shoulder to where the twins were crawling on the floor. "She would have liked them. And probably scolded me for bringing toys before asking permission." Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Permission's not something people give much in my life. It's usually take or leave." For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed outside the window, a siren wailing far away. The twins' laughter rising and falling like the sound of a smaller, brighter world. As days turned into weeks, the visits continued, sometimes brief, sometimes long enough to share a cup of coffee while the boys played. One Saturday afternoon, Adrian stood by her window, looking out at the courtyard below. "I used to live in a building like this," he said, his voice distant, "peeling paint pipes that rattled all night. My mom worked double shifts. We shared one room." Elena studied him. "You don't talk like someone who grew up in a place like this." He smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you spend enough years trying to sound like you belong somewhere else." When he turned, she saw something flicker across his face, not shame exactly, but the weary honesty of someone who had spent a lifetime building walls he no longer believed in. "You don't have to prove anything here," she said softly, "not to me." He looked at her, then really looked, as though the words had reached a place no one else had touched in years. The weather grew colder again before either of them realized how much time had passed. On a gray afternoon, Elena bundled the twins into their stroller and headed to the playground at the end of the block. The swings creaked in the wind. The slides were wet with drizzle. She didn't expect to see Adrian there, leaning against the fence, hands in his pockets, coat collar turned up. "You following me now?" she teased. He chuckled. "Maybe I just have good timing." They walked slowly together, their conversation light childhood memories. Seattle weather, the way the city never truly dried out. When they reached the swings, Adrian paused, his gaze lingering on the empty seats. "My mother used to bring me to a park like this," he said. "Even when she was too tired to push the swing, she'd sit and tell me stories." Elena turned toward him. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that end before they're supposed to," he said quietly. "But the ones that stay with you anyway." A gust of wind carried a swirl of blossoms between them. Elena felt a strange ache, a tenderness she hadn't allowed herself in years. That night, after she put the twins to bed, she stood by the same window, where Adrian often paused. The city lights shimmered like distant constellations. She thought about the man who had come into her life through a moment of rain and chance, about how each encounter seemed to leave behind a small trace of warmth, a space where grief could breathe without crushing her. For the first time since her marriage ended, the silence in her apartment didn't feel empty. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself stopping by her street more often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but a reasonless need to see the lights from her window. His world had never lacked for anything tangible: wealth, success, control. Yet, lately he'd begun to understand what it meant to lack something deeper. The sound of laughter that wasn't practiced, the kind of company that didn't need explaining. He wasn't sure what this was between them. Gratitude, perhaps. recognition, or maybe something waiting to bloom after a long, cold winter. One evening he arrived at her door, holding not a gift, but a folded piece of paper. "I was cleaning my mother's old things," he said. "I found something I think you should see." Elena let him in. The twins were half asleep on the couch, wrapped in the blue blankets he'd given them. He unfolded the paper carefully, a photograph faded and warm with age. Two young women stood side by side in front of the same red brick building she lived in now. One of them was his mother. The other was hers. "My mother used to tell me," he said, his voice soft. "This place wasn't much, but it was ours." Elena touched the edge of the photo as though it might vanish. "I didn't know she ever lived here." "Neither did I," he said. "But I think maybe that's why I keep coming back." The room fell quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock. In that stillness, they both seemed to feel it, the strange symmetry of fate, the echo of two women's friendship carried forward through their children. Outside, the rain began again, light and rhythmic against the window pane. Adrian rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Elena," he said gently, "you don't owe anyone strength all the time. Sometimes letting someone stand beside you isn't weakness. It's what keeps you standing." She didn't reply, but her eyes softened, a quiet thank you, shimmering beneath her calm. When the door closed behind him, she stood for a long moment, watching the rain blur the city lights. For the first time, she didn't feel like the world was something she had to face, alone. And in the quiet hum of that evening, something unspoken began to take root between them. Not love yet, not fully, but the steady, undeniable beginning of it. The quiet didn't last. It never did. By early summer, the days had grown long, but the light in Seattle carried an edge, the kind that warned of rain even when the sky was clear. Elena could feel it, a change subtle at first, then heavier like air before thunder. The twins had turned one. They were crawling faster now, pulling themselves up on the furniture, laughing at things she couldn't see. Those sounds, the small defiant music of their joy, had become her anchor. But peace, she had learned, rarely came without interruption. It began with a knock on her door one Wednesday afternoon. When she opened it, the man standing there made her blood go cold. Mark. The name alone carried years of exhaustion. Her ex-husband looked thinner than before his eyes, glassy, his jacket worn at the edges. The smell of whiskey clung to him, sharp and familiar. "Hey, Lena," he said, smiling like they'd just met at a party. "You look good." She stepped into the doorway, blocking his view of the apartment. "What do you want, Mark?" He shrugged, running a hand through his hair. "Just wanted to see my boys. I've been thinking maybe it's time I take some responsibility." Her pulse quickened. "You lost that right the day you left." "Come on," he said, shifting his weight. "I've been clean. Got a new job. I'm trying." His voice cracked slightly, just enough to make her hesitate the way he always did, weaving truth and manipulation into the same breath. From behind her, one of the twins began to cry. Mark's eyes flicked toward the sound, hungry, possessive. "I'm their father," he said, quieter now, but colder. "You can't keep them from me forever." Elena closed the door, firmly, slowly. Her hands shook afterward, but her voice didn't when she whispered to the empty room, "You won't take them from me." That night she sat awake long after the twins had fallen asleep, the shadows shifting on the wall like ghosts she'd tried to bury. When her phone buzzed, she almost didn't answer, but the name Adrian made her chest loosen. "Adrian, are you awake?" "Elena." "Couldn't sleep. Adrian." "Something wrong, Elena?" He came back. "Mark." The typing dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Adrian." "I'm on my way." She started to type, "Don't," but stopped. For once, she didn't want to be strong alone. By the time Adrian arrived, the city was wrapped in a heavy fog. His car headlights cut through the mist like twin ghosts. Elena met him at the door. She hadn't realized until that moment how much steadiness his presence carried. He didn't speak, just looked at her, reading the fear she hadn't voiced. "Did he threaten you?" he asked. "Not in words," she said. "But he will. He always does." Adrian nodded, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't have to face this. I've faced worse." "I don't doubt that," he said softly. "But you shouldn't have to face it alone." She turned away before he could see the tears that surprised her. "What are you going to do? Buy him off?" His silence was long heavy. "If that's what it takes to keep you and the boys safe, yes. Money won't fix this, Adrian." "No," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "But protection might." The next day, a man in a plain gray suit knocked on her door. "Daniel Lee," he introduced himself. "Security consultant. Mr. Cole asked me to check in." Elena almost closed the door again, the instinct to refuse any help older than reason. But the memory of Mark's eyes stopped her. Within hours, the locks were changed, the stairwell lights repaired, and a camera installed above the entryway. Daniel stayed discreetly near the building for the next few days. When she thanked Adrian, he only said, "I told you, you're not alone anymore." But Mark wasn't gone. He started small, a note slipped under her door, the handwriting crooked. "You can't keep them from me forever." Then phone calls, a voice that hung up when she answered. Once she came home to find the stroller moved from the hallway. Adrian insisted she move in with him, just until things calmed down, he said. But she refused. "If I run every time he shows up, he'll never stop." He admired her resolve, but it terrified him. The confrontation came one rainy night in late June. The power flickered in her apartment. The twins were asleep. Outside, thunder rolled over the rooftops. She went to check the front door and froze. The lock had been jimmied. The door stood slightly ajar. "Mark." Her voice trembled despite herself. No answer, only the creak of a floorboard. She backed toward the crib, heart racing. Then, before she could reach for her phone, the door burst open. He was there, soaked, wild-eyed, the smell of alcohol clinging to his breath. "You took everything from me," he hissed. "My boys, my life." "Get out," she said, voice breaking. "Please, Mark, they're sleeping." He took another step. "Then maybe it's time they remember who their father is." A sharp crack thunder outside, and another sound behind him, the door slamming open again. Adrian. He moved fast, pulling Mark back by the collar, the two men crashing against the wall. "You come near her again," Adrian said through his teeth, "and I will end this in court, or worse." Mark snarled, trying to shove him off. But Daniel appeared in the doorway a second later, phone already in hand, calling the police. When the sirens finally wailed down the block, Elena stood frozen, clutching her sons, her breath shallow and ragged. Adrian crossed to her slowly, his hand hesitant. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears spilling before she could stop them. "I thought I was done being afraid." He brushed a damp curl from her cheek, his touch careful, reverent. "You were never afraid. You were surviving." She looked up at him, then at the man who had started as a stranger in the rain, whose quiet had turned into something like safety. And though she couldn't yet name what she felt, she knew. This. She trusted him. Later, after the police left and the twins were asleep again, she and Adrian sat in the dim glow of the living room. The rain tapped softly against the window. "Why do you keep showing up?" she asked finally. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, then at her. "Because once, Someone saved my mother from a fire. She never forgot it. I think she'd want me to do the same for her friend's daughter." Elena's throat caught. "You really believe that's why you're here?" He met her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "I think that's how it started, but it's not why I stay." The rain deepened outside, soft and steady, the kind of rain that washed the city clean. Elena leaned back, her eyes closing for a moment, listening to the rhythm of it, to the breath of 2 sleeping children, and to the quiet heartbeat of a man who refused to leave when the storm returned. For the next few days, time seemed to slow, not peacefully, but in that strange way life does after fear. Elena moved through her apartment as if the air had changed texture, heavier, now fragile. Every noise from the street, a car door, a shout, a sudden crack of thunder made her heart lurch. Even the rain, once a comfort, sounded different. Adrian came by every day, never staying long, never pressing. He brought groceries, checked the locks, talked softly to the twins, as if their laughter alone could quiet the shadows that still lingered in her walls. But he could see it, the tremor in her hands, the way she started awake at every sound. He'd been in boardrooms filled with crisis, had faced down men who could collapse markets with a phone call, but he had never felt so helpless as he did, watching her try to smile through fear. On the 3rd evening after the break-in, he said quietly, "Come with me. Just for a while. Somewhere he can't find you." She shook her head. "I can't keep running." "This isn't running," he said. "It's breathing." They left before dawn the next morning. The city was still half asleep, streets glistening under the last traces of night rain. Adrian loaded the twins' things into the car, every movement precise, deliberate, the way he did everything. Elena stood on the sidewalk watching the light spread slowly over the skyline. She hadn't left Seattle in years. The idea of driving away, not to work, not to survive, but simply to leave, felt unreal. When Adrian opened the car door, she hesitated only a second. Then she got in. They drove south for hours, the scenery shifting from glass towers to open fields. The air grew lighter, the clouds breaking into long white ribbons. Adrian didn't talk much. He seemed to know she needed the quiet. The twins slept in the back seat. Elena watched their reflections in the window and thought of everything that had brought her here. The rain, the stranger, the storm. It all felt like a story that didn't belong to her anymore, one she'd been forced to read aloud until she forgot how it ended. When the road curved into a valley, she saw it, a wooden farmhouse nestled among tall pines, its windows catching the morning light. A porch wrapped around it, pale curtains shifting in the breeze. "Where are we?" she asked. "Oregon," he said. "My mother's place. I haven't been here since she died." The car rolled to a stop beside the porch. The air smelled of rain and cedar. Somewhere in the distance, a river murmured softly through the trees. Inside the house felt like memory-faded photographs, the faint scent of lavender, the warmth of wood that had known laughter. Adrian carried the twins to a small room at the back where sunlight fell in wide stripes across the floor. He set their things down, then paused, looking around. "She used to read to me here," he said, "right by that window. When the world felt too loud, this was where she brought me." Elena traced a finger along the edge of the windowsill. "It's beautiful. It's old," he said, "but it's safe." That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept. The days that followed unfolded slowly, tenderly. Elena woke to birds instead of sirens, to the sound of the twins laughing somewhere in the grass. She cooked breakfast while Adrian fixed a broken shutter, the scent of coffee drifting through the open kitchen. Sometimes in the late afternoons, They'd walk down the path toward the river. The air shimmered with light, and the boys would chase the dandelion seeds Adrian blew into the air. In those moments, he looked nothing like the man who ruled half a city. He laughed freely, eyes crinkling, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, the world stripped of titles. Once, as they sat by the water, Elena said quietly, "You don't belong in places like this anymore." He smiled. "Maybe I never did. Maybe that's why I come back." She watched him skip a stone across the surface of the river, the ripples widening until they vanished. Something about it, that gesture, that peace felt like a truth she hadn't allowed herself to believe, that it was still possible to begin again, even after everything. One afternoon, while Adrian was fixing a loose gate hinge, Elena found an old wooden chest, tucked behind a stack of books in the hallway. Inside were letters yellowed and delicate. The top one was addressed in a handwriting she recognized from the photograph Clara Ward, her mother. She unfolded it carefully. "Dear Clara, if my son ever meets your daughter, tell her not to run from kindness. I did once, and it cost me more than I can say. You saved me that day in the factory. I never forgot. Maybe our children will find each other one day. Maybe they'll understand the things we never said out loud. Anna Cole." Elena read the words twice, her breath catching. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as though the distance between past and present had suddenly folded in half. When Adrian came inside, she showed him the letter. He read it slowly, his voice quiet, reverent. She wrote this the year before she died. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was heavy with something sacred, the weight of two lives entwined before they'd even met. Elena whispered, "Maybe this is what she meant by not running." Adrian looked at her, then his expression soft, searching. "Are you running now?" She shook her head. "No, not anymore." That evening, the sun dipped low behind the trees, bathing the house in gold. Adrian stood on the porch watching the light fade, and Elena joined him, the twins sleeping inside. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full alive with everything they didn't need to say. Then Adrian reached out his hand, brushing hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a declaration. It was simple, almost tentative. A quiet acknowledgement that some storms don't destroy. They clear the air. The sky above them deepened into violet, the first stars glinting faintly through the dusk. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. She was simply there, safe, seen, and unafraid. And though neither of them said the word aloud, it hung between them, gentle and certain love, arriving not with thunder, but with the soft, steady sound of the world beginning again. Summer softened into early autumn, and the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath. Mornings came with golden light slanting through the curtains, the smell of coffee and the soft thud of little feet running down the hallway. The twins had learned to say "Mama" clearly now. And sometimes, when Adrian came into the room, one of them called out, "Dada," their voices bright with joy, that didn't yet understand the weight of names. Elena would smile, half in embarrassment, half in something deeper. Adrian never corrected them. He just crouched down, patient and tender, letting them tug at his sleeves while laughter filled the kitchen. Those small, ordinary moments became their rhythm. There was no talk of forever, no promises made, but something wordless lived in the spaces between their days, a stillness that only people who had lost too much could truly recognize. It was the peace of not needing to explain why you stayed. One evening, as the air turned crisp, Adrian found Elena sitting on the back porch. She had wrapped herself in an old quilt, her eyes following the sunset, that painted the trees in copper and honey. A small pot of soup simmered inside. The twins were asleep, the baby monitor humming softly beside her. He sat next to her without speaking. The silence between them had become easy, like an old song neither of them needed to finish. After a while, she said quietly, "Do you ever think about going back to your real life?" He turned his head toward her, the fading light catching in his eyes. "This is my real life, Elena." She smiled faintly. "You know what I mean. The business meetings, the boardrooms, the people who call you sir." Adrian exhaled, leaning back. "Sometimes I do, but lately, when I think about what matters, it doesn't look like any of that." He paused, his voice low. "It looks like this. You, the boys, this house, quiet, honest things." Elena's throat tightened. "Honest things don't last long in my world." "They can," he said softly, "if you stop expecting them to break." That night after he went to bed, she stayed on the porch long after the moon rose. The air was cool, the stars bright above the dark silhouettes of pine trees. She thought about how strange it was to find safety in someone she hadn't trusted at first, to find warmth after so many years of cold. And yet, even in this peace, fear still lived somewhere deep inside her. She knew storms didn't always announce themselves. A week later, a letter arrived. Daniel brought it. He'd been keeping quiet watch from the small guest house nearby, just in case Mark tried to find them again. His face was grave as he handed it to Adrian. "It came through your office," he said. "Forwarded twice. No return address." Adrian opened it carefully, his hands steady. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mark's. Inside were only a few lines. "You think you've won, but you can't keep them from their father. A paper won't stop me." Adrian folded the letter without a word. When he looked up, Daniel saw the shift in his expression, still calm, but sharpened by something fierce. "I'll handle it," Adrian said. But that night when Elena noticed his silence at dinner, she knew. He didn't have to tell her what the letter said. She saw it in the way he glanced toward the windows, how his eyes lingered on the twins a little longer than usual. Later, after the boys were asleep, she found him outside standing near the fence, where the porch light faded into darkness. "Don't keep it from me," she said quietly. "If he's still out there, I deserve to know." Adrian turned to face her, his voice even. "He sent a letter. Nothing more. Nothing more is never just nothing," she replied. "Not with him." He sighed. "You shouldn't have to live with that kind of fear." Elena crossed her arms, holding her elbows tight. "I've lived with it before. But this..." She gestured toward the house, toward the faint light spilling from the window. "This is what makes me afraid now, because I finally have something to lose." He stepped closer. "Then I'll make sure you don't." His words weren't grand, but they carried a weight that made her chest ache. And for the first time, she believed him. The days that followed were quiet again, almost deceptively so. Adrian made calls, discreet but deliberate. Daniel expanded the security around the property. The sheriff in the nearby town was informed, but life inside the farmhouse went on. The twins began taking their first steps. Elena clapped and laughed until she cried. Adrian filmed the moment on his phone, but when she tried to take it from him, he only smiled. "This one's mine," he said. At night, after the boys were asleep, they sat by the fire with mugs of tea, the glow soft on their faces. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to. It was on one of those quiet nights that Elena finally said it. "I keep wondering how it ends." Adrian looked up. "What does this?" she said softly. "You, me, the boys, the peace, Things like this don't last for people like me. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You're wrong. When she didn't answer, he added, the world doesn't decide what you deserve. You do. She smiled sadly. You sound like my mother. He reached out, taking her hand gently. Maybe she was right. When she went to bed that night, she dreamed of her mother standing at a kitchen sink, hands in soapy water, turning to say something she couldn't quite hear. But the look in her eyes was clear. Don't run. Not this time. Elena woke with tears on her pillow and the faint gray of dawn seeping through the curtains. She went to the window. Outside, Adrian was already in the yard, coffee mug in hand, watching the mist lift from the grass. He turned at the sound of the door and smiled, that quiet, unguarded smile that always seemed to find her first. She stepped out barefoot, the wood cool beneath her feet, and joined him. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two people who had walked through very different storms, now standing in the same calm morning. The past hadn't disappeared. The danger wasn't entirely gone. But there in that golden half-light, Elena realized something she hadn't before. Peace isn't what happens when the storm ends. It's what you choose to build while the clouds are still moving overhead. And beside her, Adrian reached out his fingers, brushing hers in the quietest promise imaginable that no matter what came next, they would face it together. By late autumn, the valley had turned to gold. Leaves scattered across the porch, and the mornings came with a chill that smelled faintly of pine and memory. The farmhouse stood steady against the wind, the same way Elena now stood within herself. The twins were walking everywhere, fearless little explorers with their mother's stubbornness and Adrian's quiet curiosity. They filled every corner of the house with life. Their laughter became a kind of music, a heartbeat that reminded everyone what survival was really for. For the first time in years, Elena woke without dread. The nightmares had faded. Mark's letters stopped coming. There had been a restraining order, then silence. Real silence, not the kind born of fear, but of distance. And somewhere in that stillness, something remarkable began to take shape. Peace. One morning, while mist still curled over the fields, Elena found Adrian outside fixing the garden gate. His sleeves were rolled up, his breath visible in the cool air. She leaned against the porch rail, smiling. You work too hard for a man who used to have a chauffeur for his espresso. He looked up, grinning. You work too hard for a woman who swore she'd never let anyone help her. She walked down the steps, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Well, she said softly, maybe I learned something about letting people in. He set the hammer down and turned toward her. And she said, her voice quiet, but sure. It feels like coming home. He stepped closer, his hands brushing hers, rough, from work, but warm. The wind caught her hair, lifting it gently. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the trees, the sky, even the faint whisper of the river nearby. Then Adrian said, You saved me, you know. Elena laughed softly. I didn't do anything. Yes, you did, he said. You reminded me what love looks like when it's honest, when it's earned. She blinked back, the sudden blur in her vision. And you reminded me what it feels like to be safe enough to love again. They married the next spring, quietly, just a handful of people, a few wildflowers from the field, and sunlight filtering through the trees. There was no grand gown, no orchestra, no vows, read from paper. Elena held Adrian's hands and said simply, You found me in the rain. You stayed through the storm. I think that's all the promise either of us ever needed. He kissed her forehead and whispered, And I'll keep it for all the days we have left. The twins, now toddling around in tiny suspenders, clapped their hands when the ceremony ended. Someone played a fiddle from the porch, and laughter drifted across the fields like a prayer answered. Years later, when the house had aged a little more, and the children had grown into their own laughter, Elena would sometimes sit by the window in the early morning light, the same quilt around her shoulders, the same sound of wind in the trees. She'd watch Adrian outside, tending to the small orchard they had planted the year after the wedding. He'd wave up at her, his smile still the same, quiet, steady, patient. And she would think of the woman she used to be, standing in the rain, clutching 2 crying babies and a box of regrets, and realize how far that girl had come. How she had learned that love, real love, doesn't arrive to rescue you. It arrives to walk beside you, steady, imperfect, and utterly human. Sometimes when she visited her mother's grave in the small town nearby, she'd bring a single apple from their orchard. She'd set it down and whisper, "You were right, Mama. I didn't have to be strong forever. I just had to hold on long enough for love to find me." And then, as the wind carried through the pines, she'd hear the faint laughter of the twins in the distance, and the sound of Adrian's voice calling her name, home calling her back. Years don't always make us older. Sometimes they just make us softer. Elena had lived long enough to know that the heart, even when bruised, never really gives up. It waits quietly, faithfully, for the day it can trust again. And when that day comes, it doesn't ask for fireworks or forever. It just asks for one thing: to be met halfway. So if you, dear reader, have known loss, if you've sat through long, sleepless nights, wondering if it's too late to be seen, to be held, to be loved again, remember Elena's story. Love doesn't care about the years you've counted. It only cares that your heart is still willing to open its door when someone knocks softly enough. Because sometimes the greatest chapters of our lives begin long after we thought the book was over. And when the rain comes again, as it always does, you'll know to step outside. Because somewhere in that rain, love might still be waiting for you.